Before we present this year's award, it's my honor to introduce one of Dan's classmates. Sean Cohen is the Senior Creative Director at Travel Click, a global hospitality-focused company based in New York. He works with new brands such as Nobu, the Cosmopolitan of Las Vegas, and Dream Hotels, as well as more traditional hotel brands such as Hilton and the Four Seasons. Sean lives with his family in Baltimore City, where his main occupation is keeping his 3 children out of trouble and his wife ignorant of his family's mischief. So please join me in welcoming back to the Hollow and to Loyola, Sean Cohen.
Thank you, Ms. McNeal, for inviting me. On the 4th of July, 30 years ago, Dan and I were on the Underground, the Metro, in Britain. We were thoroughly lost. We were at the East End of London, which is not a good part of town, when 2 punks, the size of brick houses, swaggered onto our train. A history lesson. British punks in 1986 were not highly sensitive. They were not like Hogwarts rejects. They didn't have black eyeliner. They didn't have like black hair over their eyes. They were not shy, right? These guys would scare Sid Vicious. They were shaved bald, and they were pale, like a weird kind of sick pale. The larger of these guys was as tall as he was fat. He was pierced everywhere, and he looked to have like blood on his forehead. And he wore layers of torn clothes. They both smelled of urine and alcohol. When they saw us, like this predatory light came into their eyes. Dan and I were 14. We had pretty ties. We had darling, just darling, suit jackets. Do you remember Dan's green jacket? It was an apocalypse. I can only say that we looked as tiny and as terrified as it is humanly possible to look. We looked like prey. These punks were a horror show. All I could think was that the next day in the London Times would say, 2 insanely stupid American kids were eaten for dinner by local reptiles. So I sat in my seat ready to pee myself when Dan, and I say this with a lot of affection, Dan is like the diametric opposite of Jason Bourne, okay? He's not ready, in a way. So Dan says in a nasally, sort of squeaky voice, "Hi, happy 4th of July." What could I do? He's my friend, and he's about to be eaten by horrible cockney lizards. What would I tell his mom? That I ran away? So I stood up, and I walked up to him, and I said quietly, "Dan, these scholars are not interesting, okay?" And then he shouted, and this is where it got weird. He says, "A socialist government will never be able to address your grievances. As long as you stay on the dole, you're babies. Thatcherism and privatization is the only thing stopping the infantilization of the British people." And it was like a hush fell over the world. And after the longest pause possible, the larger punk, he scratches some of the blood off his forehead, and he says, "I must admit, I'm of 2 minds about privatization." And whatever it was, whatever was going on there, it just shattered. We had a conversation, it ranged from politics to school to our respective home lives, where we lived. It was sort of great. It was a little weird. It was smelly, right? At the end, the large punk said, "Yo, warmongering Reaganite. It was good to meet you." And he and Dan did this really cute little fist bump thing, right? And then he got all serious, and he leaned down, and he looked Dan in the eye, and he said, "American dude, Bon Jovi be with you." And Dad said, "And also with you." And so that's Dan. I'd spent 4 years at Loyola having lunch with Dan every day. It was a real disappointment. He was horrible to have lunch with. He just wouldn't, perhaps he just couldn't, sit down, okay? He would wander the cafeteria, and this wasn't the fancy schmancy cafeteria you guys have. You have working lights, you have non-toxic, like water, okay? You have illumination from windows you can see through. Anyway, he would wander the cafeteria saying hi and being Dan. And I'd say, where are you going now? Who are you going to abuse next? And he'd say, I'm going over to those hippies. And I'd say, do they know that you have extreme contempt for their beliefs? And he'd say, oh yeah, I told those Birkenstock-wearing tree huggers that their pinko commie environmentalism was a dying primitive delusion. And how did they respond? They loved Dan. That's how they responded. He not only knew their names, he knew the names of their family members, and the fact that one of them had a sick dog. He talked to the misfits. He talked to those guys who were gay. He talked to the potheads, the musicians, and even the football players. I know, very hard to understand. It sounds like something anyone can do, doesn't it? Walking around saying hi. How are things? This is what Dan would do. And the truth, I think, you can correct me, is that no one does this. High school and later life are filled with imaginary boundaries, which you cross at your imaginary peril. Shall I go over and extend myself to that stranger? Maybe not. It seems uncomfortable. What makes a person a good communicator is, in essence, an ability not to be fazed by the more problematic or offbeat aspects of their own characters. Dan was full of, I guess you could call it, fury. His energy was boiling off him. He was having this massive lover's quarrel with the world. Good communicators can separate themselves from their disappointments, from their naked beast, from their unpopular hidden thoughts, their awkwardness. They can look upon their grotesque opinions and their ugly inner selves without losing confidence or collapsing into self-disgust. Dan was extremely critical of himself. He didn't think he was handsome. He thought he was clumsy, and he really sort of was. He was awkward with his hands. They would flutter around when he got excited, which was basically all the time. He thought he was fat. He thought he was stupid, if you can believe that. Often he kicked himself for doing too little, for not accomplishing enough. A good communicator can speak clearly because they've managed to develop a second sense of their own acceptability. They like themselves well enough to believe that they're worthy of and can win the grace of others if they can only present themselves as themselves. I think Dan was a great communicator, and I think that really mattered. But I think what might have mattered more was what he chose to communicate. It's said that the Eskimos have 50 words for snow, and this makes sense if it's true, because they're describing their world with nuance and specificity in a way we probably all should. We only have one sloppy, overused, bloated, unclear word for friend. Anamkara is an old Gaelic term for soul friend. This is the kind of friendship that has no cage. It's where you find weird things like police and thieves who are best pals. It's when you find out that Scalia and Ginsburg were best friends, and it boggles the mind. And then you wait a moment, you're like, wait, that seems so right. It's the startling kind of friendship that ruptures all barriers of convention. It rips against them through affluence, gender, age, religion, nationality, race, society, or morality. All of that is wiped clean, and you're struck by two souls who are entwined in friendship. I think Dan broadcast that kind of friendship. I think he was a beacon of it. I think he was saying to the world, I'm open to being your friend. I think he ultimately forgave himself his perceived inadequacies. And his forgiveness of himself somehow meant that in his presence, we were forgiven our inadequacies. At Loyola, I learned, and I think among so much that we all learn, we begin to understand more deeply that teamwork is vital. This thing of life is really a team game. Camaraderie and neighborliness, we find, is the pivot upon which civilization rests. And we find also that being a gentleman isn't this abstraction. It's a real thing, and it matters. But C.S. Lewis wrote, very deep friendship is unnecessary. It's like art. It's like philosophy. It has no survival value. Rather, it's one of those things that gives value to survival. Like you, Dan wasn't tall. Like you, Dan wasn't the captain of the football team. He wasn't even an athlete. Like you, Dan was awkward with women. He would say stupid things, and he constantly blushed. Do you remember his red face? All the time. Like you, Dan wasn't a perfect student. He did well, but he was no valedictorian. Like you, Dan was friendly, but not all that popular. He got votes, but few invitations to parties on Friday night. Like you, Dan wasn't really funny. He found himself more laughed at than with. But unlike you, and unlike me, Dan pulled himself out of his pocket. He pulled the lid off and shared that inner gigawatt of brilliance with the world. Like you, we all have that in us. And we're here today to celebrate that. To recognize that there's a spark within us that calls to God, and it's answered. And that calls to our friends, and it's answered. Dan shared some of his light with us, and I think we are forever grateful. So dear Dan Walker McNeal, I guess by all this I mean to say, I miss you. We miss you. You continue to make a difference, and may the light you've given us never dim. Thank you.